So hello, everyone, and welcome to another conversation of the fifth cycle of conversations on corporeal architecture. My name is Maria da Piedade Ferreira, and today I am very glad and honored to introduce you to Milton Shinberg. Milton Shinberg, AIA, has been a practicing architect for 50 years. He joined the faculty of the Catholic University of America School of Architecture in 1978, has taught all studio levels and his seminar Beauty and Brains since 2004. His investigations, writings, and lectures focus on connections between empathy, affect, and architectural neuroscience, including design applications. He has made presentations to national audiences in the USA and international venues, most recently for NAD in Venice. He is active in the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture. Milton, thank you so much for accepting this invitation and joining us today.
Thank you, Maria. I'm happy to be here. It's nice to be back in your class. For those who've never seen my studio here, it's my happy mess between painting over there, working here at the computer, working on a book about our favorite subject, neuroscience and architecture, and a few other activities as well. So I'm going to go back to share screen and pull this up. And slideshow from current slide. All right, can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, so this is actually about how you relate to architecture, how it gets to you and how you are affected by it.
Milton, sorry to interrupt you, but we can see both slides. We can see the current slide and the next slide.
How about now?
No, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, all right. So one of the things that I really enjoy doing as a design architect and also working on these ideas as a teacher is to see what matters, find out what actually has an impact on how people engage or not. And so I've filtered over the years my interest, and one of them, so it's now centering on engagement, which is how you connect, but tuning is how you design. Okay, so I'm going to start with something called the striatum. And Maria, do you think the students are familiar with that term at this point?
Not yet, no.
Okay, so the striatum is a part of the brain. It's somewhat diffuse. It's actually related to the limbic system, instinct, and memory. Well, what it does is enable you to operate through habit and not so consciously. Things that do matter. When you drive a car, if you drive a car, you can be thinking on a familiar route, not about the familiar route and how to navigate because your brain already knows that, but you can be listening to some music or talking to someone else in the car. The striatum is the processing device that keeps you going. It happens to have a lot to do with architecture. Just think about how much in the environment we are not paying acute attention to because we're just moving through space. So it's an ancient thing. We wouldn't have survived without habit. Habit allows for speed of processing. Okay? But survival does depend also on dealing with acute situations. And when the striatum is breached, it's breached by figure. In this case, this is the figure of a predator who shows up, at which point we're not driving a car, but if we're walking across the savannah, we stop and we have to deal with this instead. So the striatum, imagine it as a kind of bubble. And when I talk about the architectural consequences of it, it's going to be how we manipulate piercing that bubble. So here's something the striatum might be taken care of, dealing with walking in a city street. But then we get distracted and we get into dangerous situations because we operate too much on habit and not enough on being in the present moment. So what happens if you're not breaching that bubble is there's a kind of processing containment that includes neuronal activity. And like walking, you don't think about walking. If you've ridden a bike and you got good at it, you don't think about riding a bike. But it also relates to the environment. And here's a typical American housing development. And actually, I think this one's not from America, but it's very routine architecture. And you don't pay much attention to it. Things are designed not to stand out much. It's tuned down to be background buildings, which also means that the striatum can take over most of the work. Walking down the street, you're not distracted. Your attention doesn't go to any kind of interruption. And the same is true actually in more complex environments that you use habitually. Here's a beautiful side street in a hill town. It doesn't require consciousness. So the striatum is operating not at a pre-conscious level because it's not preparing for consciousness. It's operating at a non-conscious level. Nonetheless, when the bubble is breached, it becomes conscious. One way I like to think about the brain is that lots of operations are taking place all the time that we don't have to pay attention to. We don't need higher consciousness. We don't need the frontal lobe operating at full bore. It's always operating, but we don't need it at a high pitch all the time. So I think there's a kind of knocking on the door. The brain is efficient. And when you need conscious attention, it says, okay, conscious brain, time to get going. So the other thing the striatum does is it mediates stimulus response. So you're approaching a pleasure or you retreat from a fear, that starts the alert that breaches the striatum. So what does it do? It holds, maintains, and reinforces habit, memory, and associations. And a lot of those associations are emotional. And as long as they're not disturbed, as long as they stay in comfort and homeostasis and not into fear, the striatum is doing just fine. But it has lots of connections. And these connections, when they're activated by the piercing, are still there, but now they're contributing to conscious processing as opposed to non-conscious processing. So the links are to cognitive spatial memory in the hippocampus, to the amygdala. And what's the breakout? The breakout occurs with novelty. What do architects do? We decide when we're tuning how much novelty to introduce into the experience of people. So Le Corbusier, here's the secretariat in Chandigarh in India. He wants to break through the striatum of ordinary buildings for a purpose. It's not just because he feels like it. It's a device for finding the front door. So he creates a pattern, that's background, and then he breaks it. That becomes foreground, it breaks out of the striatum, okay? So the first time you see it, you pick up on these stronger contrasts. Here's another example. This one's piercing, you know, in terms of perception, it's piercing the sky plane, which gets your attention. Familiar sight, also piercing the sky plane, also piercing the sky plane. So sharp angles tend to be not part of the vocabulary of survival on the savannah. Shapes were softer, rounder, or stick-like, but not like this. So our ancient battery or our ancient library of images doesn't include this. So let's talk about figure ground as another kind of tuning. Switch gears a little bit into something more familiar. Figure ground is something as a term that's used in a lot of different ways, sometimes just black and white contrast. Or you look at a Noli plan of Rome, and you look at what is figure and what is ground. The buildings are usually black, the streets are usually white, but that's not cognitive figure ground. Cognitive figure ground is what gets your attention. So in this particular instance, can you see my mouse?
Yes.
Okay, so this is actually a cathedral in California, and these two wings are the ground that flank this disturbance of a pattern in the center. So this becomes the primary figure. That's where your attention goes. You attend to figure. Then looking further, you see the second ground, which is literally ground. But first your attention goes to this. Same is true of cities. Here's a view of a familiar city. Color is a differentiating element, breaks the striatum. Height also, and form contrast. And here we have the Sydney Opera House with its unique shape. Also, in this case, piercing memory. Less contrast and form contrast. Okay, so architects have to be skillful about some things, and one of them is to tune the strength of figure against ground. So just to give it the most basic definition, figure is what interrupts ground. So here it is in nature. Of course, we don't have grids like this in nature too much, but here is a leaf that stands out because it is totally dissimilar in organic form from the regular form behind it. Here's a Noli plan. A cathedral, which is an interruption in the urban fabric, sometime around 900 to 1500 or 1400, people started taking out the center spaces of cities and making them the site for the cathedral, which is a figure against the ground. Okay, so if you are in a more habitual situation, like a house, you're going to tune that down typically, because what happens in the house is mostly relational between people and looking for comfortable settings, not seeking high levels of stimulation. It's a place to relax. So you would have weaker contrasts. This is a facade that we did in my office for a school, in which we wanted it to be familiar, but on second look, to gain more information. So that even though it's a habitual situation, the striatum is perfectly happy getting kids in and out of the school, we also have a chance here to enrich that, to keep a level of attention, to tune it up a little bit. So these textured areas here don't have to be there. It's an ad. It's manipulating the surface to gain attention, okay? Obviously, this gains a lot of attention, and it becomes, if there's enough attention, it becomes a landmark. So then there's something called the insula, which is related. And I want you just to take a minute to read this. So I won't read it to you. So the insula is the switch itself that says that the striatum now has to confront, it has to give up some control in order for other parts of the brain to take over, okay? It occurs in the part of the brain called the anterior insular cortex, acting as a type of gate between low-level sensory information and high. Okay, so it's a trigger. And here's where it is. It's in the fore part of the brain, the front of the brain, not quite where the frontal lobe is, down below, and it's closer to the limbic area. Emotion triggers attention, and emotion triggers the need to go to a higher level. So in this diagram, here is where the insula lives, and here's the limbic lobe right here, and you can see that they're very proximate, but so is the frontal lobe, which then can be activated. Speed of neuronal transmission is a survival matter. So things are proximate to each other that need to talk more rapidly, okay? So at a non-conscious level, the insula also contribute to bodily homeostasis, but it does something else too. It's engaged with empathy and self-awareness and relationship with others. So you can see there's an interesting bunch of things that are happening in the insula. One of the reasons is that when you meet someone, you need to turn on a higher level of consciousness to find out, are they friend or are they foe? It's also related to movement. So movement is the end of the cognitive cycle. You take in information perceptually, you process it cognitively, this is very oversimplified things, but the ultimate purpose of cognition is action, and movement is the typical action. Okay. It also projects to the amygdala, and that's where fear-related behaviors live. So here we get our line again, fight or flight. Now I want to talk about something to change gears quite a bit. So this has to do with outside and inside in architecture. So this is something completely different. We've talked about the striatum, we've talked about the insula, and this talk is going to cover some other matters as well. So layers of outside and inside. If you operate in a city or a village, you're walking around, let's call that outside. You get to the plane, which defines a building face, the envelope of the building. If you penetrate that through a door into a courtyard, whatever that is, you're going through a plane. But there are plenty of examples, especially in vernacular architecture, where going from outside to inside brings you to a new kind of outside and layers outside, inside, outside. The reason it's in this talk is that it's about design as a tuning device. So permeability, there's permeability within the brain in that different brain areas talk to each other and do so with a lot of fluidity. But there's also permeability to the outside. It's a kind of physical myth that our containment of ourselves stops here. In reality, we are projecting out into the environment and gaining information from the environment. So we are also permeable with the environment. This is kind of an illusion that we are separate. So this is a painting by Gustav Klimt that I like because it shows a number of things, but one of them is a kind of sense of permeability. The figure reaches out into what's around it. You can think of it like a Wi-Fi network. We are linked to lots of other things in the environment, and our brains are extraordinarily good at balancing those connections. So now I'll talk about physical permeability, degrees of transparency and opacity. Alberto Campo Baeza designed this building, which is entirely about transparency, except if you look on the left side, it's opacity. So he's created a separation from the greater outside, which is the town that this building is, to an inside space, which now is the outside for the building. So one of the things that architects get great pleasure in is tuning the layers. So more about permeability. What I like to talk about is that architectural experience is not static. It's shifting, it's layered, and it's intimately interactive. So permeability also has to do with movement through time. So I like to use the word porous to describe our relationship to the world. We are in it and we engage in it. So those are permeability to outside influences. Our mental processing, our embodiment, our movement through space is also permeable outside to inside. So what are the permeable senses? Permeable senses are the regular sensory equipment like eyes and ears and nose and touch, etc. But there's also permeable cognition, where all the different parts of the brain processing are welcoming information and processing it. Permeable embodiment. When you walk through a space, you're taking in information. There's a permeability and a reciprocity, another word for that, between you and the environment that you're moving through. Permeable culture. We have context for the architecture that we are living in, and culture is also permeable, as is memory. The permeability of memory is profound for humanity, for humans, but also in architecture, because when you recall something, you don't recall what you actually experienced, contrary to a couple of models, traditional models. The newer model is that memory is totally contextual. You only remember what gets in and had meaning or impact. And every time you recall, the memories are modified by the recollection. So all the brain processes together are permeable because they interrelate, but they're also flowing in both directions. The model of outside-inside for cognition is wrong. It says sensation hits us, perception does some processing, and then the rest of the mind of cognition happens. That's very linear, and that's not how it works. Let's talk about the rich tapestry. The brain's job is to create a sense of oneness. In other words, complete information about what's outside. So things are permeating within us, permeating with what's outside of us, and it brings us toward human needs and capacities. And there's a couple of specific things that I'll talk about that help us design more humane environments. Has the term affordance been brought up in the class?
Yes.
Okay, so we're really talking about affordances here, the relationship between the capacity to engage and what is designed or what exists that relates to our capacities. Okay. It's interesting because the goal of creating more humane environments is shared by architects and neuroscientists. Maria and I have had a lot of contact at conferences with neuroscientists, and they are just as dedicated to making good environments as we are. So here's a couple of examples of permeability. And again, it's turning the dial, tuning. So here's a semi-transparent facade. Is it transparent for the fun of it, or is it because this curved stair has importance in the building? There's a pattern, it's broken, it makes figure. Here's a project from my office where permeability was tuned not to be transparent, not to bring you out of the building, but to have a sense of nature without actually seeing the trees. This is a school we designed. This is a library that looks out on a playground. And the tuning here is the use of vertical ribs that are spaced at irregular intervals. So depending on where you stand in the space, you see more or less of what's outside. And when kids are running outside, you see a choreography, you see a play of behavior against the semi-transparent, tuned skin of the building. So you're seeing outward and connecting. Barcelona Pavilion is an exercise in permeability. It's a manipulation of planes to guide you through the building to create choreography through what is transparent, what is semi-transparent, and what is clear. This is a modification to a house in Washington that we did, or Maryland. And you can see that we're using different treatments of different surfaces to create different areas of permeability. This is actually the courtyard of a house. This is coming to the outside. This glass cube over here, completely transparent. And then there's a green wall that is punctured so that you can go through this into the house. And here it is at one time of day, and here it is at another time of day. It reads differently, but this is actually a statement about permeability. It's a statement about pattern, breaking pattern, and creating entrance. Architects don't do one thing at once. We do many things at once. Okay, so this is another example from Washington. These are row houses, and you can translate this to lots of urban settings that have opaque facades, or fairly opaque facades. Just think Amsterdam for a minute, long, long, long blocks and along the canals that are opaque. How does that make you feel relative to Alberto Campo Baeza's facade of all glass inside a wall? Here, this is tuned to have a strong sense of being inside and leaving the outside. There's no second sequence. Once you're inside, you're inside. As opposed to this, this is the Arab World Institute in Paris, where there's a very carefully designed screen that has punctures in it. From the inside, these punctures are large relative to your eyes and your cone of vision. From the outside, they're small. So you have a sense of watching without actually being watched. So that's a wonderful example of tuning a facade. Now, there are different ways of talking about the engagement that we have with what's outside. And empathy is one of the words we talk about mostly with people. You have an empathic relationship with people. But Einfühlung actually gets to the notion of a dynamic connection, not only with people, but environments. It's about reaching out into the environment and taking in what the environment gives you. If you want to note a great author on this, it's Harry Francis Malgrave, Mallgrave. If you haven't come across him, he has a book called From Object to Experience, which is masterful in talking about this. Maria, you're smiling. Has that been assigned?
No, I was just actually, I'll take the cue. Here for the students, you can watch a conversation with Harry Francis Malgrave. It's from last year, and it's also on the channel. So if you want to go deeper into Einfühlung, you can start with a conversation. Then, of course, you should read Harry's books. Thanks.
Yes. He's terrific and he's just a brilliant architectural thinker. So one word that also goes with Einfühlung is resonance. As architects, if we make something that doesn't match up with the affordances between what we make and people's capacity to receive it and interact with it, there is no resonance. Humane environments don't exist without resonance, which means you have to understand the people and their reactions. Let's talk about physical and emotional permeability in terms of the reaching out and taking in. It's embodied. It's a visceral connection. It's a physical response. If you stand in a space and tell me you feel nothing, I will tend not to believe you. There's always feelings attached to being in different places. It's not going forward. There we go. Here we go. I just forgot that I had noted the book. So where does this reside? Is this something that actually can be localized in the brain? And the answer is, to some extent, yes. There's a repository where memories are formed, and it is the limbic system. And you've already, I'm sure, know quite a bit about the limbic system. But I'll argue that it is the seedbed of meaning in life and architecture and art. It's referred to as the ancient brain, but in a way, it's the most essential part of our brain. Spatial orientation takes place in the limbic area, navigation and pleasure. So those are pretty important parts of human existence. Now, here's a tuning of architecture that is unfriendly. This is the Boston City Hall, and it's pretty unfriendly as a brutalist building. And if you didn't think it was uninviting before, here it is up close. And what's interesting about it also is, where's the entrance? Your eye wants to go, yeah, stay outside is the message. Let me go back. Your eye wants to go to what is centered by these flanking brick areas. The brick areas are red, the building is not red, so they are figural, and they force your attention physically. I feel it in my body, force me to the center. And what do I find in the center? I find opacity. I have to move to the side to get into the building. This is a very unsuccessful manipulation of architectural experience. Okay, now here's something that actually doesn't look very friendly, but turns out to be very friendly. This is Aldo van Eyck's orphanage in Amsterdam. And it's friendly because the basic underlying idea is totally humane. And this is an orphanage is defined by Van Eyck as a place for people who have no place. In other words, they're detached from the environment. They're separated from parents who are no longer around, and they may not have other caregivers. So they live in this place. So how do you provide what people often need, which is turf? That's another thing we tune. It's easy to say, if I have my backyard, it's not yours, that's my turf. But what happens in a place where everybody has to share space? So what Van Eyck did was, in the concrete, he had embedded inside the form little pieces of colored glass. And at different times of day, the light strikes the glass and illuminates the color. Well, that's nice, but what difference does that make? If you remember growing up, probably walking from one place to another, from your home to a school or a friend's house, there were little cracks in the sidewalk, which you noticed, or where the root of a tree stuck out, or where a branch hung down a little bit low, or where the sun peeked through at certain times of day. Those memories are very particular. And in a way, when you move through space and you can attach yourself to those memories, it's like turf. Those become your experiences, nobody else's. So kids walking around this site, seeing the concrete and seeing the sunlight hit it, different times of day, they would notice certain things, and that made the space and the turf theirs. Okay, here's a place that is a modern setting, but is trying to imitate traditional settings. And some of the aspects of friendliness have been incorporated, but not quite as well as here. Just think about all the elements that are engaging you, particularly in the image on the left. The softness of the light, the width of the walkway. You're close to the people in the cafes, but you're not too close to them. So this is tuned for friendliness. Here's an example of layering. I'm sure you know this building by Rietveld. And here, the reason it's a manipulable surface is that it's not a surface. It's a series of surfaces of different sizes. And the goal is to provide transparency in some areas and the prevention of seeing figure in others. So layering is a device that precludes seeing figure. You have to get past it, so it induces movement. You get around it to see what's inside. It's an invitation to movement. So here's just a simple diagram that shows this plane creates an obstacle to seeing what's behind that plane all the way in the back of the room. Since your cognitive process demands conclusions, that's how it works. That's the cognitive cycle. Cogno means I know in Latin. That's what your brain is aiming to do. Until you find the it and understand the it, you're not going to stop. And that's why movement is caused by obscuring the figure. So that's something else we tune. Here's an example. Layering doesn't have to be parallel planes. It can be curves. It can be complex forms. It doesn't have to be planar. So now we'll switch to something called coherence. And coherence is pretty simple thing. It means that it feels like it works together. It's a feeling, it's a state, it's embodied. When something is coherent, you feel it's okay. Why? Because your brain can capture it, can understand it. Well, coherence is also involved with reaching out, coherence between inside and outside, taking in, and also pausing in an environment to really feel it with the empathy and unfooling in nature or in what is built. So a balcony and a front porch share something in common. Refuge and prospect is something that you're all familiar with, I'm sure. But a place that is separate, but not completely separate, can be protective, but still engaging. So balconies, that's why people like balconies. That's why people like houses where you can see out into nature. This is a protective space, but not one that is a fortress. This is a project we did in our office. We literally cut a rock in half, put one half on one side of the glass and the other on the other side of the glass. We wanted to really make sure that there was no question about what was going on. This is a cancer treatment center in England, and in it, there's a sense of protection, something you tune, and then you see outside from there. So there are zones of architectural experience that have different ways of dealing with coherence. There's city scale, avenues, side streets, plazas, and building scale. And I'll just give a couple of examples of those. So city scale, Louis Khan in Bangladesh. Let me go back here. There's an opacity here and a formalism that is may be something that you like to look at, but it doesn't really invite you in. When you go to Brasilia, Lucio Costa, who was the urban designer, created a sense of layering and forming attention. So you can see that the towers back here, which is the Secretariat there, as you approach it, your attention is focused on that. When you get closer, it gets softer. From a distance, it's hard. Up close, it becomes softer and more engaging and more humane. I think there's a mistake here, which architects should pay attention to, which is that at the monumental scale and from a distance, it doesn't feel empathic. It doesn't feel humane until you get up close. I would argue that if you want the experience to be humane, you would have that permeate everything. Okay, in Barcelona, at the scale of an avenue or a promenade, look how many things have to happen. There's a place for people to walk, there's a place for buses, there's a place for cars, there's a shady side, there's a sunny side, there are umbrellas. This is an urban environment that is tuned to be friendly. And in fact, this is the Rambas, and it's totally occupied all the time, very busy place. And here's an avenue in Washington, D.C., which is very busy and not so friendly. It's really dominated by cars, and there's very little street activity along the edges of it. But there is a powerful figure that it frames, as at Brasilia, the Secretariat is framed, in Washington, the Capitol is framed. Okay, so let's look at pedestrian streets for a minute, because something happens that doesn't happen at those larger scales, which is that there is no competition in terms of the dangerous presence of cars in these streets. So the striatum is happy. You can be navigating, and then instead of paying attention to lions or big dangers, you can pay attention to what's being sold in the shop and not have to worry about walking down the street. Here it is at plaza scale. This is back to Washington. So here we have a fountain that's supposed to be friendly. It's not particularly, but it forms with these two bracketed wings an axis. That's good for coherence because bilateral symmetry is inherently coherent. There's not a lot of complexity. What's on this side is balanced by that side. and it frames what's in the middle. So just getting closer and getting closer, it brings you to the figure. Okay, we're all familiar with this one. Its presence in St. Mark's Square is dominant. And although it's not on a 90-degree run, it's essentially axial. So there's coherence, and the building itself is bilaterally symmetrical. The entrance is larger, so it's been tuned to say where you go. Back to inside and outside. Here we have Notre Dame before the fire, and here's the rose window. That is very strong on the outside of the building. It's also very strong once you get into the building. So there's a connection in terms of its geometry between inside and outside, but the difference is startling. The amount of color that you see when you're inside compared to what really is pretty opaque on the outside. Nonetheless, it tells you with the light that there's an inside-outside relationship. So is it always positive to have coherence? Sometimes you have to argue the negative to understand the positive, but it's also true that you need to consider consciously whether more coherence or more transparency is a good or bad thing. Here's some examples. This, I would say, is positive. I don't like the building particularly, but there's a positiveness about it, positive element in it. This is the Ford Foundation in New York City, designed by Roshan Dinklu, and it's not a new building, but you can see that there's substantial areas of glass. The Ford Foundation is a reaching out organization. Its purpose is to send money to worthy targets. Here's the inside. It's justified as a thermal envelope so that the facade of the building, which is actually here, that contains the offices, is not exposed to extreme heat or cold. I'd say the real meaning of the building is its transparency into the space. So the world of Manhattan is the outside. You come into here, here's a new outside, and then finally inside the offices, you get inside. So you're manipulating those layers. This is a building in Washington. It's the Dance Institute. And one of the things that we did in the Dance Institute was put translucent glass in some places, like here and up here, and transparent glass elsewhere. We wanted the dancers to see out. We wanted to see the dancers who were in these studios here to see in. But at night, we had projectors that projected actual dance on the translucent glass, on the frosted glass, to create a kind of freeze, as is at the Parthenon, or at least when the Elgin marbles were not in Britain, which is a kind of dance around the top of the building. So we created a different kind of dance, and traffic stops when that's going on. Here's the inside of the building. Okay, this is a building I did some years ago, and its problem was the lack of a street face, but because the building was set back 100 feet from the street. So what I decided to do is to build a wall with tuned transparency so that there's a pedestrian entrance here that goes down an alley to the entrance, and a larger one for vehicles and fire trucks and anybody else who had to get in. So this is a permeable layer or semi-permeable layer, unlike the bank building next door, which has punched openings, which says, you're outside, I'm inside. Instead of that, at the Winter building, there's outsideness, and then there's a more intimate level of outsideness, and then there's insideness. This is a famous place in Washington, Ben's Chili Bowl. It's a hangout. People go there. They've gone there for decades. And it relies on transparency to see what's inside, but look at the activity on the inside. Here it is at night. Lots of transparency. Now, it's not always positive. This is a building that we designed in Chicago for the Botanical Gardens, and it was meant to be a background building. And this was taken just after it was built, but there are metal espaliers that climb up the outside that give you, that will eat the building after a while. Here's another one where we have huge doors that roll back to create transparency and passage into this house, which is actually a private art collection. This is a synagogue where we have a layering system. We have bilateral symmetry. It's slightly angled, but it's still bilateral to define the entrance. And then when you go in, it channels you into the main space. Now, meaning comes into this as well. This is another synagogue, And what happens in a synagogue has a lot to do with the ark, where the Torah or the Bible is kept and taken out on special occasions for reading. If you know about that process, you would recognize on the outside of the building that this is the back of the ark. And so you have meaning and association, and there's transparency around it, but in the actual space, the actual object is protected by opacity. Now, are there other negatives? Well, here's the Paris Opera. Should it have been more transparent on this facade? And the answer is no, it needed to have a sense of definition. And I know we've got about, I'm almost done with my time, correct, Maria?
Yes, we should speed up a little.
Okay, well, I'm not gonna rush through, because I think what I'll just do is take a pause. I'll go through a little more. You're familiar with this and the controlled permeability of Ronchamp and breaking through the striatum. An all glass building which no one can occupy. All right, so I'll just make the point there are positives and negatives that produce different results. And I'm just going to show you some examples. One of the things that we can do, Maria wants to do, is to take a look at some of these examples, and you tell me how they're working in terms of the striatum, in terms of layering and tuning. So that's, Maria, that's up to you. If you want to just have questions and answers, or you want to actually do an exercise.
I think we could go to the Q&A.
Okay.
Of the layout here in the room, and also we need to pay attention to the time.
That's fine. So I'll stop share.
Okay, great. So thank you for this really enriching and also very, very dense presentation. I could see
yes.
Here in the room, they were really very focused in absorbing, because there was a lot of new concepts and new ideas that they didn't hear about. So I would just start by first making a comment. It's not so much of a question, but it's more of a comment, that I find it specifically helpful also for our students, that you present this whole array of design components or aspects of design that we can think in a kind of systematic way how to first start to approach these topics of neuroscience for architecture, also in a practical way. So actually your presentation is also very enriching, exactly because it makes the connection between these more abstract theoretical concepts and the reality of actually applying this knowledge to concrete examples. So thank you very much for that. Also because we can see examples from other architects or notorious buildings, but also from your own practice. So it's great to see a live example of someone who for a long time has been doing a dedicated study to these topics, and also basically putting them into the real world and actually experimenting really on site. So thank you so much for that also. So my first question would be, from your experience of working with this knowledge, really trying to apply it within the context of design, did you do any post-occupation studies, or do you know do you have any measure or any idea of the actual impact in the users?
It's a great question, and the answer is that largely no, but not entirely, because the way practice works, as you know, is that you're finished with this project, you're working hard on the next one. Nonetheless, I just finished one post-occupancy survey of children in an elementary school, the one that was the library with the fins. And I asked, and they were happy enough to help me by having the children draw their favorite place. So I now have a stack of drawings that I'm reviewing, which tells me a lot about what actually does have impact and what doesn't have impact in terms of my design intention versus their actual reception, to see if there's any kind of alignment. Because architects, we fool ourselves all the time about what we think is going to have impact versus what actually has impact. And I know Ann Sussman was talking about the VAS software that tells you where you actually look. So there's some backup for that. So I have done some post-occupancy and school projects where I've gone back to see if my ideas about making teaching environments were successful. And they were, but not because I'm brilliant. They were successful because I started by listening very carefully to teachers and students.
Mhm.
So one of the things I'm doing in my book right now is writing about what I call client-sourced architecture, where they are the source of the ideas. I'm the designer. I have to translate that into form, but they are the ones who actually tell me what is necessary for success. And hopefully that means it'll be successful. And usually it has been based on that metric, their opinion.
Yes, and I know because we already know each other for a few years. I know that you also worked on a project. I don't believe you showed it today, but I would like to bring it up anyway, because before we were having a small talk about the topic of diversity, and I know that you also worked on a project for highly distractible students. That's how you address them. So perhaps you could maybe now talk a little bit about this experience. What were the requirements? Because this was also something that we discussed previously today.
Well, it was a formative experience for me as an architect because it was the first school I ever designed. And highly distractible students, actually any extreme reveals a lot about what you should be designing for. So in this case, there was an extreme situation. These kids were not succeeding in regular schools, and their teachers were had to deal with a major challenge, and they were teaching with a different modality because the students needed a different modality. So I had to put aside all my assumptions, which is a great way to start working in a medium or project type, a typology like schools. So they told me that the students they just became exhausted at the teaching table because it was hard for them to learn. So one of the teachers, when I was talking with them, said, too bad this building doesn't have bay windows, doesn't have, bays that are more like a house. And instead of letting that go, I pursued it. And after about 20 minutes, found out that they like bay windows because it's a place where you can be out of the room without being completely out of the room. So we started calling them areas of repose. So it worked behaviorally for the students. They could, on their own, get up from the teaching table, go into what we created, which were in the corners. We made triangles to make internal bays in the room, lower the ceiling, change the lighting, change the color, soft cushions to sit on or a little couch, and then plants to provide a layered tune separation between for the kids who are inside these artificial bays and the teacher, who could still see them, and they had the comfort of being seen, but they could return to the teaching table whenever they were ready to recharge and come back. So it worked. The teachers and the students I monitored later, and the teachers were exuberant about how it had radically changed the teaching environment for the better. Very rewarding for me. And it also told me that listening is the essential part of design, not imposing a design, but listening.
Absolutely.
Listening carefully.
Milton, and I also wanted to bring this example up because I personally identify as such a student. I had lots of problems. I went to normal school. My parents are both teachers, so at home we had a more flexible way because I have two sisters and we have some similarities in this regard. So we need a lot of movement and so on. And I particularly have trouble being sitting for a long time or not having the opportunity of excusing myself and so on. So I totally understand that design solution is ideal for someone with those requirements, because you also don't want to be like my elementary school teacher used to do to me when I would get too excited and finish everything too quickly. She would put me at the table at the corner at the end of the room where there was the class board, and I was doing something else there on the corner, but I felt very isolated. So but this was a very small school in a Portuguese suburb, and the teacher did what she could with the space she had, with the affordances she had. But I find this a wonderful example of a thoughtful architect who is able to listen, but also who has the knowledge base, and to be able also to foresee a design solution that can create these kind of accommodations. And this is also a great example to see how an architecture project is also an opportunity to understand how we can shape the reality of people and understand that people have different needs. This whole topic that we very often also talk in our discussions about neuroscience and architecture, about no standard human, and to be able to provide accommodations for different needs. So wonderful example.
I'll add one thing to it, which is that architects love to have wonderful pictures of their work to share, to show off, to get awards, to publish. Some of the best things I've done can't be captured in photographs because they are supports for behavior. And to me, I think the most successful design I ever did were those areas of repose. To me, I think that may be the best thing I ever did. Can't be photographed.
Absolutely, Milton. I would just add there that I think it's also very important that the way that you articulate behavior is not so much from this, it's from the perspective of an architect who actually listens to what is the desirable behavior from the perspective of the user and
Right.
not from the designer. Because and often in our discussions also with neuroscience for architecture, we have this influence of the hardcore behaviorists who have influenced the architects who think that we can shape the human by shaping the space, and then this space will shape the human, while actually we should be thinking about the problem exactly the other way around. We need to understand the human and not try to change the human by creating the conditions of space. Because in this case, for example, with the highly distractible students or maybe the autism spectrum in general, we could say, this is a determinant factor. Now neuroscience tells us that there are people with specific brains, and we need to understand their needs, and we cannot think that perhaps we could change them by forcing them to adapt to other conditions.
That's why I like the term resonance and mediating the space rather than harder edge terms that start to imply that we are manipulating as opposed to mediating.
Exactly. Thank you. Very important that you exactly brought this up. So I already took a lot of time from the Q&A, and now I would like to give the word to our students for the questions. Who would like to?
You're not all feeling shy today, are you?
They're feeling a little shy today because we don't have the owl, although the owl sometimes is also a reason for shyness. I don't know what's going on. There was a lot of new concepts, and I think that
I threw a lot at you.
Maybe I will give them a little more time, and I will ask if someone here in the virtual audience, Robin is here, Hassan is also here, if there would be a question or a comment, to see if we get a little time here in the room.
Well, if you like, I'm probably suffering from the same, it's a teeny bit of overwhelm. There's just so much wonderful stuff that I have found ties together. It was just a lovely way of looking at things we're familiar with or maybe unfamiliar with as your own work so far. What a wonderful lens to be looking at it through. So I have enjoyed it thoroughly. It's lovely to see you, Milton, as well.
Nice to see you around.
And I'll be thinking about this for a long time, and I would love to see examples of that school and what you did, even if it doesn't photograph.
I actually had to make up an exhibit to describe it. And it just had to be made up graphically because it's not photographable.
Excellent.
I think there's a question, right? You can come here, and even if you don't appear on the camera, we can hear you. Milton will be able to hear you. We have a little adjustment in the setup today.
Yes, so I'd also like the way you
Sorry, Milton, can you hear? Is it all right?
I can hear you more than I could hear your students. So if your student can get a little closer.
maybe if you get a little closer.
So I would like to confirm that I really like the how you explained all those principles, and that you also showed that those principles are in architecture during a long time, also in those historical buildings. But however, I wonder how you can transfer and shift them to urban spaces, like to urban planning in a more complex context, where you have those buildings which are one by one very close, and not just those monoliths which you showed a lot.
It's a great question, because most of the architectural world is already built. New buildings and are teeny fraction of what's coming into the experiences of architecture. We see things that are published that make it seem like new buildings are a greater impact than they really are. So that's a great question. I'll go back to the notion of tuning, which is to say, how much transparency, how much connection between outside and inside is really desirable. And I think that is a philosophical question as well as a pragmatic question. So you wanted to ask about the urban scale. I think what comes to my mind is that I would argue for less consistency. I think the variety of spaces gives lots of different people lots of different ways to relate to spaces that are private, semi-private, very public. And one of the things that helps a lot are pocket parks, or places where people can have gardens and use common space for that, or to have a gap or a variety of buildings in a zone of buildings where it's not all lockstep, this, and this. I find that very isolating. When I'm walking down the street and it's just all opaque, it feels very rejecting to me, actually, not welcome at all. In terms of urban planning, I would say at the largest scale, you would look at those qualities that make places friendly, and you'd want to test the environments and the rules that govern those environments in terms of their friendliness. The proxemics is a way of looking at the distances between people and other people and things to promote certain behaviors, not control, but promote, offer possibilities for behavior. And cities these days are doing a better job incorporating those kinds of questions, those kinds of answers into urban design profiles. Here's how wide the sidewalk needs to be. Here's how much distance you need to separate cars from people. Where can the cafes go? So those are actually much better understood now in urban planning terms than it was even 10 years ago. It's really become much more embedded in planning.
Thank you. Is there any other question here in the room? No? Okay, so I would just add here, Milton, to this topic of proxemics, because I was now thinking about it. What's also going to be complex, maybe now thinking more about the future, as we know more and more about neuroscience, and we come up with a few, say, guidelines or maybe principles of what we can already see that could work. To design more focused on the user, we might be at some point also dealing with a few cultural obstacles. Because, for example, with this topic of the proxemics, from my own experience of living between cultures, for example, the notion of personal space in Portuguese culture, where I come from, and in German culture is very different. The personal space in Germany is much wider. You have to be much more careful and so on, which actually for me personally always felt better than the Portuguese notion, which is much more close and everything a bit more fused. But we have also to have these things in consideration. And it's also, I had to think about Le Corbusier, for example, when he designed for India, and he thought that he was creating, the most modern affordances, the most efficient solutions, and then people rejected them because they didn't relate or it didn't reflect their culture. But he was already looking into some of these studies.
And actually, I'll contradict myself here, because Louis Kahn's Dhaka interestingly, I find very hard, but the people who live there, who he spent some time with, quite a bit of time with before he started to design, love it and really appreciate it. It does resonate with them. And so here we have a cross-cultural situation. It doesn't resonate so much with me, but that doesn't matter. It resonates with them.
Exactly. And sometimes it's also things that such relationships also develop over time, because going back to Le Corbusier, the unité d'habitation in the beginning was not very successful. People rejected it, and then it was also heavily criticized. Christopher Alexander was sort of a specialist in criticizing Le Corbusier. But the fact is that nowadays, when you interview the people who live there, they love it. They are very happy that there's a kindergarten in the rooftop, and they think it works very well, although of course this could also always be debatable. The reasons why the very privileged people who do live there like to be in this isolated island, but the fact is that they do appreciate it. So this is also something to be taken in consideration.
I agree.
I don't know if you would have any final comments. We would finish for now.
I think the comment I would make as a teacher to students is that observation is essential, because if you're not attuned to looking and understanding what's out there in the world, your design will be talking to yourself. And I think that becomes a really important thing. How do we as architects, what are the tools that we have? One of them is video, one of them is drawing, one of them is talking, chatting, asking people questions. So curiosity should guide you for the next, bunch of decades that you're involved with architecture, however you choose to be involved with architecture, to be curious and receptive and open to learning. We don't know best. I think that's an important part of our profession, to recognize that. Just one other thought is that I'm more and more uncomfortable with the notion that we're talking about neuroscience in architecture, because I think what we're really talking about is neuroscience and the behavioral sciences. I think the things that determine behavior are not all captured in brain functions. So I'd like to soften that edge in my interactions in my writing.
This is interesting. I think this would be a good start. Maybe we can both make a note. We can make a note about this for another topic, for another conversation. Because I would maybe disagree with you a little bit at this point, but now we can continue there. So unfortunately we have to finish. But I will just read that there was a comment here in the chat from Kirk Hamilton. Thank you for a terrific presentation. I'm glad to have been invited to observe the class. Thank you. Thank you to Kirk. He's not here anymore.
You're most welcome.
Okay, so we finish for now. So thank you so much again, Milton, for a terrific presentation. Always a great pleasure, and also for rescuing our schedule, most of all. Also, so
Always happy to be part of your class, Maria. It's always great.
Thank you so much, Milton. So all the best. Bye bye. See you
Bye-bye.
soon.